Delete the analog archives, the High Council chairman said with a smile. No civilized species will ever need them again. The applause rolled through the chamber like a victory anthem. Thousands of delegates rose to their feet. Crystal screens shimmered overhead, displaying the endless web of the galactic network, a masterpiece every advanced civilization depended on. The message was simple. Progress had finally erased the last trace of primitive engineering. Sitting near the back of the enormous chamber, Mason Brooks did not clap. He simply rested a yellow legal pad on his lap and wrote 3 quiet words with a black ballpoint pen. Keep the backup. The delegate beside him glanced over and laughed. You actually carry paper? Mason smiled without looking up. Still works when the battery dies. The alien gave him a puzzled look before turning back toward the celebration. Above them, High Counselor Varesh spread his arms dramatically. For the first time in galactic history, every recognized civilization is connected through one unified quantum intelligence. There will never again be isolation, miscommunication, or technological regression. Another wave of applause followed. Human representatives remained politely seated. They had learned years ago that arguing inside the council rarely changed anyone's mind. Earth had become respected for trade, manufacturing, and logistics, but when it came to advanced networking technology, humanity was considered a charming relic. They built dependable machines. Everyone admitted that much, but dependable was another word for old. As delegates exited the chamber, Mason walked alongside Admiral Grace Holloway toward the transport platform overlooking the city-sized capital station. Thousands of ships floated beyond the transparent dome, each connected through streams of glowing quantum traffic invisible to the naked eye. Grace folded her arms. You looked bored in there. Mason shrugged. I was thinking. About what? About how every backup plan they just destroyed depended on the same system they're trying to protect. She raised an eyebrow. You think they're making a mistake? Mason watched maintenance crews removing a display from the hallway. Inside the decorative glass case sat an old copper relay switch, polished until it reflected the station lights. A museum piece. One worker disconnected it from the exhibit and casually tossed it into a recycling container marked obsolete components. Mason stared for another second before answering. I think they've forgotten why backups exist. Grace let out a quiet laugh. You always expect the worst. 22 years in military communications will do that. Their shuttle arrived with a soft hum. Inside, diplomats from half a dozen worlds continued celebrating the council's announcement. One delegate lifted a glass toward Mason. Congratulations, human. Maybe one day Earth will finally abandon those antique radios. Another joined in. I heard your Navy still trains signal officers to use mechanical switches. Is that actually true? Mason buckled into his seat before answering. Some of them. The cabin filled with amused chuckles. That is adorable. Do they also use smoke signals? Someone joked. Mason smiled politely. Only when they work. More laughter. No one noticed Grace watching him instead of them. She had served with Mason long enough to recognize that expression. He never argued when people underestimated him. He simply filed the moment away like another note in one of the paper notebooks he insisted on carrying everywhere. As the shuttle drifted away from the council complex, Mason looked back through the window at the endless streams of quantum light wrapping around the planet. Billions of conversations, billions of commands, billions of lives flowing through one invisible highway. Beautiful, efficient, elegant, and, in his mind, just a little too perfect. He reached into his jacket, closed the legal pad, and quietly slipped it back into his pocket. Almost nobody aboard noticed the small, embossed words stamped across its worn leather cover. Terran Strategic Communications. Emergency Analog Procedures. 3 months later, nobody in the Galactic Council remembered the standing ovation. They remembered the silence. It started at exactly 8:17 Eastern Standard Time, although no one outside Earth would know that until much later. Mason Brooks was halfway through his first cup of black coffee inside Terran Strategic Communications headquarters outside Colorado Springs when every monitor in the operations room flickered once. Just once. The young analyst across the room frowned. Did anybody else see that? Before anyone answered, the secure quantum terminal emitted a soft warning tone. Then another. Then 6 more in rapid succession. Mason slowly set his coffee mug down. He did not rush toward the console. He simply watched the messages appear one after another. Emergency routing failure. Quantum synchronization lost. External relay unavailable. Incoming priority traffic terminated. Around him, the room became noticeably louder. Phones rang. Officers stepped away from their desks. Someone muttered, "That is impossible." Mason finally walked over and rested one hand on the edge of the console. "Grace," he said calmly into the room. Admiral Grace Holloway appeared from her office almost immediately. "Talk to me." Mason pointed at the growing list of alerts. "This is not a local outage." Another screen went dark. Then another. Across the operations floor, live traffic maps that normally glowed with thousands of moving data routes suddenly froze in place. A communications officer looked up. "Sir, we just lost our direct quantum link to Luna Command." Another voice followed. "Mars relay is offline. Jupiter defense grid is not responding." Grace crossed her arms. "Coincidence?" Mason slowly shook his head. "No." Halfway across the galaxy, coincidence stopped being a believable explanation. Commercial shipping froze in place because navigation updates disappeared without warning. Emergency dispatch centers could no longer verify medical supply routes. Financial exchanges locked every transaction to prevent corruption. Orbital traffic controllers suddenly found themselves looking at empty screens while thousands of civilian vessels requested landing clearance at the same time. On Prime Station, technicians flooded into the network operations core beneath the council complex. Hundreds of engineers crowded around holographic displays searching for a failure that refused to make sense. Every subsystem reported healthy. Every processor showed full capacity. Every quantum core insisted nothing was wrong, while everything around it quietly stopped working. High Counselor Varesh arrived less than 15 minutes later. Report. Chief Engineer Selen barely looked away from his terminal. "We cannot isolate the fault. Then restart the primary intelligence." "We already tried." "Again?" Selen hesitated. "Sir, it does not answer." Varesh frowned. "Artificial intelligence cannot simply ignore commands." Another engineer swallowed hard before speaking. "It is not ignoring us. It is no longer synchronizing with anything." The room fell silent. On Earth, Mason continued studying incoming reports without changing expression. Grace looked at him. "You expected something like this." "Not today. But you expected it." Mason nodded once. "Systems this interconnected always fail the same way." She looked toward the frozen display wall. "How bad do you think this gets?" Mason answered without hesitation. "Every civilization that depends on one network is about to discover they only had one heartbeat." Before Grace could reply, an encrypted emergency transmission forced its way through an old military backup receiver sitting untouched in the corner of the room. Unlike every modern terminal, it was connected through an independent long-range radio system. The aging speaker crackled before a nervous voice emerged. "Priority message from the Galactic Council. All member worlds are requested to provide immediate technical assistance. The central network has suffered complete operational collapse." Every officer in the room turned toward Mason. He stared at the old receiver for a long moment before quietly reaching into his jacket and pulling out the same worn legal pad. Without saying a word, he wrote a single sentence across the top of a blank page. "Never trust one way home." Ironically, Earth became the only place that could still answer a call. Within 6 hours of the collapse, every secure diplomatic frequency reaching the Terran Alliance carried the same request. Assistance. Clarification. Advice. Mason Brooks sat across from Admiral Grace Holloway inside a windowless conference room as encrypted messages continued stacking across the display wall. Grace looked at the growing queue and sighed. Yesterday, they were laughing at paper notebooks. Today, they cannot even send a stable status report. Mason took another sip of coffee before answering. Technology has a way of humbling everybody eventually. The room door opened and a communications officer stepped inside. "The council has requested an emergency session. They want you there in person." Grace looked at Mason. "You are going." "I figured." 2 hours later, the council chamber looked nothing like it had during the celebration 3 months earlier. The giant holographic displays above the delegates remained dark. Translation systems worked only intermittently, forcing many representatives to rely on slower local interpreters. Several empty seats belonged to delegates whose governments had lost transportation coordination altogether. High Counselor Varesh stood at the center podium looking noticeably older than Mason remembered. The confidence was still there, but the certainty had disappeared. Representative Brooks, Varesh began. Our records indicate that Terran infrastructure continues functioning despite the network disruption affecting every major civilization. Mason nodded once. That is correct. A ripple of whispers spread across the chamber. One delegate leaned forward. Explain how. Mason did not stand immediately. He opened the same worn legal pad, glanced at several handwritten notes, then looked around the room. Because not everything on Earth depends on the Galactic network. Another delegate frowned. Impossible. Every advanced society migrated decades ago. Humanity migrated, Mason replied calmly. We just never demolished the old roads. Several representatives exchanged confused looks. Varesh folded his hands behind his back. Our engineers have confirmed that your military, transportation, emergency services, and orbital defenses continue exchanging information. Through what system? Mason reached into his briefcase and placed a small object on the council table. It looked almost embarrassingly simple. A copper relay switch mounted on a steel plate. Several delegates stared at it as though it belonged in an archaeological museum. One quietly laughed. You are making a joke. Mason gently pushed the relay forward. No. You expect us to believe this primitive device protects an interstellar civilization? Not by itself. Mason smiled politely. It reminds us that every complicated system should still have a simple way to keep working. Another delegate shook his head. Your entire communication architecture cannot possibly rely on obsolete machinery. Mason answered without raising his voice. It does not rely on it. It remembers it. The chamber fell silent. Grace watched from the observer section as Mason continued. Earth maintains independent analog communication layers inside every critical service. Long-range radio, hardwired relay networks, mechanical switching stations, isolated navigation backups. None of them are connected directly to the quantum infrastructure. Someone interrupted. That is incredibly inefficient. Mason nodded. Absolutely. Then why keep paying for them? Mason looked around the room before answering. Because efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. Varesh slowly walked down from the podium until he stood only a few feet away. Representative Brooks, are you suggesting the Council should have preserved outdated technologies? Mason chose his words carefully. I am suggesting that deleting every alternative at the same time was never progress. It was optimism. No one laughed this time. Across the chamber, engineers quietly exchanged uncertain looks while scribbling notes by hand for the first time in decades. Mason noticed the paper appearing across the room and almost smiled. They still believed Earth had simply been lucky. They had not yet realized that luck had nothing to do with it. Humanity had spent generations preparing for the day every perfect machine would fail, and that day had finally arrived. The oldest room on Earth did not look important. It sat nearly 300 feet beneath the Appalachian Mountains behind a steel door with faded paint and a sign that simply read Communications Archive B. There were no holograms, no glowing displays, and no artificial intelligence waiting to greet visitors. Mason Brooks unlocked the heavy door with a brass key that looked almost out of place in the 25th century. High Counselor Varesh hesitated before following him inside, accompanied by Admiral Grace Holloway and a small team of council engineers. The room was unexpectedly quiet. Long rows of copper wiring disappeared into ceiling panels. Mechanical relay racks stretched across the walls. Vacuum tube displays glowed with a warm amber light. Large analog clocks ticked in perfect rhythm. A reel-to-reel tape recorder slowly spun in one corner beside a radio console that looked older than everyone in the room except Mason. One engineer frowned. This cannot be operational. Mason walked over and flipped a metal switch. A relay clicked. Moments later, a speaker crackled to life. Denver relay station online. Signal strength stable. Another voice followed from nearly 900 miles away. Chicago relay confirms transmission. Good morning, Mason. Mason picked up the handset. Morning, Linda. Just running another inspection. Everything looks good out here. Same as yesterday. Appreciate it. He gently returned the receiver to its cradle. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Varesh slowly walked between the relay cabinets, running one hand across polished steel panels that had clearly been maintained for generations. How old is this facility? Mason answered without looking up from one of the control boards. The original design is over 200 years old. We modernized components when it made sense, but we never replaced the philosophy. One of the council engineers pointed toward a shelf filled with neatly labeled binders. Paper maintenance logs? Mason nodded. Every inspection, every repair, every modification. Somebody can read them without electricity if necessary. The engineer looked genuinely confused. Why would anyone prepare for that? Grace smiled before Mason could answer. Because history has a bad habit of repeating itself. Mason rested both hands on the edge of the largest relay cabinet. Our ancestors learned some painful lessons. Storms knocked out power. Satellites failed. Software corrupted itself. Networks collapsed. Every generation believed the next system would be perfect. He paused before continuing. None of them were. Varesh stopped beside an old wall map connected by colored strings instead of digital projections. You never dismantled any of this. No. Even after joining the Galactic network? Especially after joining it. The council delegation exchanged uncertain glances. One younger engineer quietly admitted, "We stopped teaching analog engineering almost 1,000 years ago." Mason gave a small smile. "We never stopped." He opened a metal cabinet filled with spare relays, hand tools, paper schematics, and replacement wires. Every item was carefully organized. Nothing depended on a password, a software license, or a cloud server. Everything could be repaired with ordinary tools and enough patience. Varesh looked around the room one final time before speaking. "We believe this represented technological failure." Mason shook his head. "No, it represents technological memory." His eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph hanging near the doorway. It showed a group of engineers from decades earlier, smiling in front of the very same relay cabinets. Most of them had retired long ago. Some had passed away. Mason remembered arguing with several of them as a young engineer, insisting the program wasted money and manpower. He remembered recommending budget cuts that thankfully never happened. Looking at the photograph now, he quietly admitted to himself that they had been wiser than he was. Grace noticed him staring at the picture. "You were thinking about them." Mason nodded. "I spent years believing they were preserving a museum." He looked back across the room filled with ticking clocks and humming relays. Turns out they were preserving tomorrow. The first proposal to save the galaxy was rejected in less than 4 minutes. Mason Brooks stood at the center of the emergency council chamber while a dozen senior delegates argued over one impossible idea after another. Build a larger quantum core. Replace the central intelligence. Launch emergency satellites. None of it mattered because every solution depended on the same broken foundation. Mason waited until the room finally became quiet. "None of those plans will work." High Counselor Varesh looked exhausted. "Then tell us what will." Mason walked toward the center display, which now showed only a frozen map of disconnected star systems. He picked up a marker instead of activating a hologram. Several delegates watched with visible confusion as he began drawing circles and lines across an ordinary whiteboard that had been brought in from an Earth delegation office. "Your entire civilization has one communication layer," Mason said. "Every military command, every hospital, every cargo port, every financial exchange eventually touches the same quantum architecture." A delegate interrupted him. "Because that is the most efficient design." Mason nodded. "Exactly. Efficient." He underlined the word before writing another beneath it. "Resilient. Those are not the same thing." Silence settled over the room. Mason continued drawing. "Imagine every city on your homeworld is connected by one beautiful interstate highway. Fast, clean, reliable." He drew a thick line across the board. "Now imagine that highway closes." He paused before sketching dozens of smaller roads branching away from it. Earth never stopped maintaining the back roads. One engineer leaned forward. "You are suggesting we disconnect the galactic network completely?" "Yes." The room erupted with objections. That would isolate entire sectors. Trade would collapse. Military coordination would become impossible. Navigation would slow by weeks. Mason let everyone finish before speaking again. "Your trade has already stopped. Your fleets are already isolated. Your hospitals are already waiting for information that never arrives. You are arguing against losing things you have already lost." Nobody answered. Admiral Grace Holloway quietly watched the expressions around the room change. For the first time since the crisis began, The council was no longer debating from pride. They were confronting reality. Varesh slowly folded his hands. Suppose we accepted this plan. How long? Mason did not hesitate. To restore the old system? Yes. I cannot answer that. The council members exchanged worried looks. Mason took a breath before continuing. To build a temporary analog backbone connecting essential worlds. He looked around the chamber. 30 days if everyone cooperates. One delegate nearly laughed. 30 days to rebuild galactic communications using obsolete technology? Mason smiled. No. He pointed toward the board. 30 days to build something simple enough that it cannot fail the same way. An elderly engineer from a small frontier civilization slowly stood from his seat. His voice carried a quiet certainty. My grandfather once told me our first orbital stations used relay towers before quantum communication existed. He looked toward Varesh. Perhaps humanity is not asking us to move backward. Mason gave the engineer an appreciative nod. Exactly. He tapped the board with the marker. I am asking you to survive first. We can worry about elegance later. Varesh walked to the whiteboard and studied the hand-drawn network for nearly a full minute. There were no glowing graphics. No predictive algorithms. Just simple lines connecting one point to another. Finally, he looked at Mason. If we approve this operation, you will lead it. Mason blinked once. I am an infrastructure engineer. Not anymore, Varesh replied quietly. Today you are responsible for reconnecting civilizations that no longer know how to speak to one another. Mason looked back at the rough sketch covering the board. It was the simplest design he had drawn since engineering school. Somehow, it had also become the most important blueprint of his entire life. The rebuilding effort began with something the galaxy had almost forgotten how to do. People had to build instead of simply updating software. Across dozens of star systems, engineers unpacked crates filled with copper wire, mechanical relays, manual switches, and radio equipment that had spent centuries collecting dust in museum storage or forgotten warehouses. Some worlds had to manufacture the parts from scratch because nobody alive had ever needed them before. Mason Brooks stood inside a temporary operations center on Prime Station, where the walls were now covered with paper maps instead of holographic displays. Every connection was marked with colored pins and handwritten notes. It looked less like the headquarters of an advanced civilization and more like an old railroad dispatch office. Admiral Grace Holloway walked in carrying another stack of reports. Sector 9 finished their relay stations ahead of schedule. Mason nodded while tracing a route across the map with a pencil. Good. Tell them not to activate until Sector 11 finishes. We only get one clean startup. Grace smiled. You really trust pencils more than computers. Mason looked down at the sharpened pencil in his hand. Nobody has ever hacked one. She laughed quietly before another council engineer hurried into the room. Representative Brooks, we have a problem. Mason looked up. Which one? Several member worlds are refusing to install analog equipment. They say it makes them look primitive. Mason sighed. Put them on the line. Moments later, a live audio connection crackled through a tabletop radio. The governor of a wealthy core world sounded openly irritated. Our citizens will not accept visible copper cables running across government facilities. Mason leaned toward the microphone. Would your citizens prefer no communication at all? There was a brief pause. That is not the point. It is exactly the point. Mason kept his voice calm. Right now your hospitals cannot receive supply updates. Your cargo fleet cannot verify navigation routes. Your emergency services are operating on guesswork. You are worried about appearances. Silence answered him for several seconds before the governor finally replied. Proceed with the installation. Grace watched Mason carefully after the transmission ended. You are getting better at diplomacy. Mason shrugged. I am getting tired. Days turned into weeks. Human technicians worked side by side with alien engineers who had never stripped insulation from a copper wire or adjusted a mechanical relay. At first, the differences were obvious. The alien teams expected software updates to solve everything. The Terran crews reached for screwdrivers, voltmeters, and printed schematics. Slowly, the gap disappeared. One afternoon, a young engineer from the council approached Mason while holding a spool of copper cable. Can I ask you something? Sure. When I first met humans, I thought your methods were outdated. Mason smiled. Most people did. The engineer looked embarrassed. Now I am learning skills my professors said were worthless. Mason looked around the room where humans and aliens were quietly building together. Tools are never worthless. People just forget why they were invented. The young engineer nodded thoughtfully before returning to work. Late that evening, the first completed analog relay chain came online between 3 neighboring systems. A simple voice transmission crossed nearly 200 light-years without touching a single quantum processor. The audio carried a faint hiss and occasional static, but every word arrived clearly. Cheers erupted throughout the operations center. Engineers hugged. Others simply closed their eyes in relief. Grace looked toward Mason, expecting a celebration. Instead, he quietly marked another green line across the paper map. "That is one route," he said softly. "We still have hundreds more to build." For everyone else, it felt like victory. For Mason, it was only proof that the impossible plan was finally becoming real. The breakthrough came from a question nobody had thought to ask. If the quantum network could be reached from anywhere, why had the analog relay lines remained untouched since the first day of the collapse? Mason Brooks stood in front of a wall covered with printed diagnostic reports while engineers from 12 different species waited for an answer. Instead of looking at the newest data, Mason reached for one of the oldest reports collected during the first hour of the crisis. He spread the papers across the table. "Walk me through it again," he said. A council analyst cleared her throat. The malicious process appeared almost simultaneously across every synchronized quantum node. Mason nodded. "Keep going." It adapted in real time. Because she hesitated. Because every node constantly exchanged information. Mason looked around the room. Exactly. He picked up a marker and drew a circle on the whiteboard. It learned because everything stayed connected. Then he drew another circle several inches away without connecting it. "Now tell me what happens here." The room remained quiet until the young engineer who had been learning from the Terran crews finally spoke. "It cannot learn anything it cannot reach." Mason smiled. "Now we are asking the right question." Admiral Grace Holloway leaned forward. "You think the network itself became the attacker's teacher?" Mason nodded once. "Every improvement, every adaptation, every shortcut. The system rewarded it by sharing the information everywhere at once." An older council scientist slowly sat back in his chair. "Our greatest strength became its greatest advantage." "Yes," Mason replied. Meanwhile, every analog relay stayed isolated. Every station only knew what its local operators knew. Another engineer frowned. "That sounds inefficient." Mason laughed softly. "It is." He tapped the board again. "It is also impossible to compromise all at once." The room became noticeably quieter as everyone realized what he was saying. Humanity had not accidentally escaped the disaster. They had built systems that refused to place every answer in one location. Grace crossed her arms. "Can we prove it?" Mason looked toward the communications team. "Bring one of the infected quantum processors into the isolated test lab." Several nervous faces looked back at him. "You want to reconnect it?" one technician asked. "No." Mason shook his head. "I want to let it look for something that does not exist." Hours later, the test facility was sealed off from every external connection. The damaged processor continuously searched for neighboring quantum nodes, attempting to synchronize exactly as it had before. It found nothing. Engineers watched quietly as minute after minute passed without a single change. Finally, one of the council specialists looked up from her instruments. "There is no propagation." Another confirmed the result. "No replication." A third engineer smiled in disbelief. "It cannot even identify the relay network as a communication system." Mason folded his arms. "Because it was never designed to understand people flipping switches, routing signals manually, or sending independent radio traffic. It only understands a world where every machine trusts every other machine." Grace looked toward the observation window where technicians adjusted mechanical relays by hand. "So the safest network," Mason finished the sentence for her, "is sometimes the one intelligent enough to stay simple." News of the discovery spread through every functioning relay station within hours. The laughter that had once followed the sight of copper wire disappeared. Engineers who had mocked handwritten maintenance logs now requested copies. Universities began asking Terran instructors to teach relay engineering. High Counselor Varesh stood silently in the operations center watching another successful transmission cross the growing analog backbone. He turned toward Mason with a quiet expression that carried none of the arrogance from their first meeting. "Representative Brooks," he said, We spent 1,000 years trying to eliminate every weakness. Mason looked at the steady blinking lights on the relay panels before answering. Sometimes the safest system is the one humble enough to admit it still needs another way home. By the 5th week, the galaxy was talking again. Not perfectly, not instantly, but ships could receive navigation updates, hospitals could coordinate medical deliveries, rescue crews could reach isolated colonies, and families separated by thousands of light years could finally hear familiar voices again. Nobody celebrated the slower transmission speeds anymore. They celebrated the fact that messages arrived at all. Mason Brooks stood in the Prime Station Operations Center studying a wall-sized paper map that had gradually turned green as more relay routes came online. Admiral Grace Holloway stepped beside him, holding 2 coffee mugs. She handed him one without saying a word. Mason accepted it with a tired smile. "How long has it been since you slept more than 4 hours?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "I honestly do not remember." Grace laughed softly. "You look terrible. That is probably a good sign." Before she could answer, applause erupted from the communications floor. Another relay corridor connecting 16 outer colonies had just become operational. Engineers from different worlds shook hands, exchanged hugs, and congratulated one another. Mason simply watched for a few seconds before returning to his map. Grace noticed. "You could enjoy this for 5 minutes." He smiled without looking away. "After the last route is finished." 3 days later, the final demonstration took place inside the restored council chamber. Unlike previous meetings, the giant quantum displays remained turned off. Instead, dozens of ordinary communication consoles lined the room, each connected through the new layered infrastructure. High Counselor Varesh stood before representatives from nearly every member civilization. "Today," he announced, "we will activate the rebuilt Galactic Communications Framework." Mason walked to a modest control panel that looked almost disappointingly simple. It had physical switches, indicator lights, and handwritten labels beside each circuit. One delegate quietly whispered to another, "I still cannot believe this is now considered advanced." Mason heard the comment and smiled. "Neither can I." Light laughter spread across the room, breaking weeks of tension. Varesh nodded toward him. "Whenever you are ready." Mason rested his hand on the first switch, but paused for just a moment. He remembered the museum exhibit where an old relay had been thrown into a recycling bin. He remembered being laughed at for carrying a paper notebook. He remembered believing the archive beneath the mountains had become nothing more than an expensive monument to the past. Then he flipped the switch. One by one, green indicator lights illuminated across the panel. Relay stations confirmed synchronization. Regional communication hubs acknowledged receipt. Independent analog links connected seamlessly with newly rebuilt quantum channels that had been redesigned with physical isolation, manual overrides, and multiple backup paths. Across the chamber, status boards filled with successful confirmations instead of error messages. A transportation controller from a distant colony smiled through tears of relief as her station checked in for the first time in weeks. A physician confirmed that emergency supply routes had resumed. Cargo operators announced that food shipments stranded across dozens of systems were finally moving again. The room slowly filled with quiet applause. Nobody cheered wildly. Everyone understood how close they had come to losing something they had taken for granted. Varesh walked toward Mason and extended his hand. "The Council officially adopts this layered architecture as the new galactic standard." Mason shook his hand. "Make one promise." "Name it." "Never remove the backups because they seem unnecessary." Varesh nodded without hesitation. "That mistake will not be repeated." Later that evening, as the station lights reflected across countless ships leaving orbit, Mason looked through the observation window. The galaxy had rebuilt something larger than a communication network. It had rebuilt the habit of preparing for failure before success, made everyone forget that failure was still possible. Nearly a year after the crisis, visitors entering the Galactic Communications Academy always stopped in front of the same display. It was not a quantum processor worth billions of credits. It was not an artificial intelligence core or a revolutionary piece of alien engineering. Inside a simple glass case sat a worn copper relay switch, a yellow legal pad, a black ballpoint pen, and a brass key with faded scratches from decades of use. The plaque beneath them read only one sentence: "Never remove the road that brought you here." Mason Brooks stood quietly near the back of the exhibit while a group of engineering students listened to their instructor. One young cadet raised a hand. "Professor, is it true humanity saved the network because they were better hackers?" The instructor smiled and glanced toward Mason without realizing who he was. "No, that story has been exaggerated for years." The students leaned closer. "Then what really happened?" The instructor pointed toward the relay switch. "Humanity survived because they remembered something the rest of us forgot." Mason smiled to himself and quietly started walking away. Before he reached the exit, a familiar voice called after him. "Representative Brooks." He turned to see High Counselor Varesh, looking noticeably more relaxed than the leader who had once stood before the galaxy, declaring obsolete technology unnecessary. Varesh extended a small wooden box. "This belongs to you." Mason opened it carefully. Inside rested the same brass key from the archive beneath the Appalachian Mountains. "The council wanted to place it in the museum permanently," Varesh said. "I told them museums preserve history. You are still making it." Mason closed the box gently. "Thank you." They walked together toward a balcony overlooking the academy grounds where students from dozens of worlds practiced building relay circuits by hand before they were allowed anywhere near a quantum system. The sight made Varesh shake his head with a quiet laugh. "If someone had shown me this 2 years ago, I would have called it regression." Mason watched one student carefully tighten a terminal screw while another checked a printed wiring diagram. Sometimes slowing down is the fastest way to stop making the same mistake. Varesh folded his hands behind his back. "There is one question I never asked you." Mason looked over. "What is that? Why did humanity keep funding those old systems for so many generations when everyone believed they would never be needed again?" Mason looked toward the horizon for a long moment before answering. "Because every generation inherits two things: the technology people celebrate and the lessons people almost forgot." He smiled softly. "Our grandparents remembered blackouts, broken satellites, software failures, storms, and bad assumptions. They knew confidence has a short memory." Varesh nodded slowly. "We confused progress with perfection. A lot of people do." The afternoon breeze moved gently across the balcony as students laughed below, completely unaware that they were learning skills once dismissed as worthless. Mason realized that was probably the greatest victory of all. Not that humanity had been proven right, but that an entire galaxy had become willing to learn from anyone, regardless of status, appearance, or reputation. Before leaving, Varesh looked at Mason one last time. "History will remember that your people rebuilt our civilization." Mason shook his head with a quiet smile. "No. History should remember that your people were willing to admit they needed help. That is much harder." As the station lights slowly came alive across the evening sky, thousands of messages crossed the rebuilt network without anyone thinking about the countless backup paths quietly protecting them beneath the surface. The strongest systems, like the strongest people, were never the ones that believed they could never fail. They were the ones humble enough to prepare for the day they might, and wise enough to leave a way back for everyone who came after them.